Mark Rogers TV back with you as we comb through all the Power 5 conference schedules in 2014, and we invite your comments because that's how it works. All right, we're done with the SEC, making our way through the new Eastern Division of the Big Ten with Maryland and Rutgers on board and Michigan State coming over from the Western Division. So let's talk about the Wolverines coming off a very disappointing 3-5 showing in the Big Ten, 7-6 overall after the loss to Kansas State in the Buffalo Wild Wings Bowl. All right, Brady Hoke took over for Rich Rod, and all looked good that first season. Won the Sugar Bowl, won 11 games, but since then, downhill, 8-5 in 2012. Although I thought that football team was pretty darn good, much better than 8-5 if you consider the opponents. But in 2013, definitely taking a step back offensively. The running attack was non-existent, and again, 7-6, 3-5 in the Big Ten. All right, Michigan plays a very traditional Big Ten schedule with 4 non-conference games, all to start out the season before they dive into Big Ten play, and the 8 conference games. And look at this. It's 2007 all over again with Appalachian State. In week 1, we will see plenty of hype and highlights leading into that one of the historic upsets in the history of college football. Appalachian State taking on Michigan in week 1 in Ann Arbor. So credit the Wolverines for putting that one back on the schedule here in 2014. Again, 7 years after the historic upset. And that Michigan team actually turned out to have a decent season, beat Tim Tebow in Florida in the Capital One Bowl to finish 9-4. All right, the rest of the Michigan slate is pretty familiar here at Notre Dame. That series will conclude. It picks up further down the line, but Notre Dame, because of their ties to the ACC, will not play Michigan and Michigan State and Purdue every year. I think it's a shame, especially this classic rivalry. Michigan at Notre Dame. The Wolverines won this one in dramatic fashion last season. And then 2 years before that, of course, in very dramatic fashion, behind Denard Robinson, lost to Notre Dame, the undefeated team, 2 years ago. So Michigan, Notre Dame at Notre Dame on September 6th. The very next week, they take on a MAC team, as just about everybody in the Big Ten does these days. Miami and Michigan at the Big House. And then an interesting game to a certain extent, September 20th against Utah. So it's not Notre Dame and one other big elite program that Michigan has on the non-conference slate. It's Utah, so that's a decent game. Actually, they had a tussle with the Utes a few years ago. I think like 25-23. Michigan survived in that game, and that was a Rich Rod game at the Big House. So you've got Appalachian State, Notre Dame, Miami, and Utah, just the one game on the road against the Irish at South Bend. So the non-conference slate, we would like to see a step up, and Michigan usually does not. Certainly back down from anyone non-conference. They play just about anybody in the country. So the Michigan non-conference slate has always been tough, not so much this year. They do have Notre Dame. I expect Notre Dame to be a fringe top 25 team. So 3-1 possibly, but Michigan's got to go to Notre Dame and win that game. They've got to establish that they're going to be a force this season in 2014. Would love to see, if you're a Michigan fan, the Wolverines win all 4 before they head to Big Ten play. All right, we've talked about it with the SEC. We talk about it with the Big Ten. It's very important who those non-division foes are, because the division foes are set. You play everybody in your division. So your schedule matches up with everybody that you're competing against to get to a conference championship game. But who do you play in the other division? So for Rutgers and Maryland, for example, they're having to play Wisconsin and Iowa, or Wisconsin and Nebraska. Who does Michigan play out of the Western Division? Well, it's a couple teams that they're used to playing in the Legends Leaders setup, with Minnesota on September 27th. That's the Big Ten opener at home. So they've got 4 of the first 5 at the Big House, and they also play on down the line November 8th at Northwestern. So they get a pretty good draw there, Brady Hoke does, in trying to make some waves in the Eastern Division of the Big Ten, and taking on Northwestern and also taking on Minnesota. The Golden Gophers at 8-5 last season surprised some people, but they're still a bit talent deficient. Michigan certainly should win both of those games. struggled against both of those teams last season. Actually, Minnesota, despite the 8 wins in the Big Ten, Michigan did have a big win over them, 42-13 last season, something like that. Struggled in 2 or 3 overtimes against Northwestern, won it on a field goal at Evanston last season. But after the Minnesota opener, they go to Rutgers. So Michigan, if they get past Notre Dame and win the games they're supposed to win, and the Notre Dame game probably a toss-up, they will be 6-0 when they host Penn State. So Michigan fans may be 6-0, but again, last season, 5 or 6-0 before collapsing at 7-6, 3-5 in the Big Ten. All right, then it gets tough. Michigan State on the road, Indiana for homecoming, at Northwestern, Maryland, Ohio State. So some tough games in there, of course. Excuse me, but for the same time, Michigan's got the tough ones spread out. So no daunting stretch. No stretch where we've seen Maryland and Rutgers having to play Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, maybe Nebraska or Wisconsin consecutively. No tough stretch. The toughest back-to-back is not even a back-to-back because they've got a bye week between Penn State and the trip to Michigan State. Maryland, Ohio State back-to-back, nothing daunting there. So they've got the toughies spread out, meaning Notre Dame, Utah to a certain extent, Penn State, Michigan State back-to-back, trip to Ohio State in Columbus the last week of the regular season, as usual. All right, Michigan probably an underdog at Michigan State, at Ohio State, unless things really radically change in 2014. Michigan will be a decided underdog in those games. They will probably be a favorite in the rest of their Big Ten games. I do not see any other game that they will be an underdog unless they really collapse this season. So Michigan is looking at 9-3 if they hold chalk on this Big Ten season, 6-2 in the conference, 9-3 overall, losing at Notre Dame. Not making predictions here, but just sketching out what possibly could happen for the Wolverines. It's a pretty forgiving schedule, Michigan. You should rack up 9 wins against the schedule, and who knows, Michigan State and Ohio State are not unbeatable. But again, at the same time, they could slip up against Penn State. Trip to Northwestern could be tricky. Maryland brings some athletes to the Big Ten, so the Terps will have to keep an eye out for them. I don't think they're ready to compete in the Eastern Division against the heavyweights, but at the same time, they will scare a couple teams this season. Count on it. All right, Michigan fans, you've got 4 very manageable non-conference games. You've got Northwestern and you've got Minnesota on the other side to play. That's not difficult. No Wisconsin this season, no Nebraska, no Iowa for the Michigan Wolverines. They lost some of those games last season, in particular the game late in the season at Iowa in 2013. All right, Michigan fans, step up, talk to us, let us know what you think about your football team and specifically this schedule right here on Mark Rogers TV.